Welcome back to the class. We are moving to the next chapter, a chapter that we begin to analyze the contributions of important thinkers. In the previous classes, we had brief discussions about a number of socio-cultural, political and economic factors that led to the emergence of sociology, or we basically try to answer the question why that sociology emerged in Europe during that particular time. What were the kind of socio-political contexts that necessitated the emergence of a new discipline? Why that the scholars found it imperative to look for novel methodological frameworks, novel epistemological base to make sense of the society that was evolving around them. So we kind of answered that the kind of time period that we are talking about, 18th and 19th century, really represented some of the most tumultuous times in the history of Europe. A world order was changing and great transformation was sweeping across the continent. So that really necessitated quite a lot of new changes, and a series of philosophers pondered over those changes, and ultimately that resulted in the codification of a set of ideas, principles, methodological orientations, and finally you have this discipline called sociology. So in this section, we are going to discuss some of the very important classical thinkers, a set of thinkers or a series of thinkers who laid the foundation for the discipline, whose intellectual engagements, whose arguments, whose counter arguments, whose propositions really laid the foundation for a new discipline to take shape and to take root, and then eventually get consolidated as a new discipline. So I have put up a list of scholars, and by no means this list is exhaustive, it's not complete. I have omitted a couple of names because it's very difficult task to enlist each and every scholar who would have contributed in this long journey of a particular discipline, especially in its formative years. So, but for this course, we will discuss these people. We will discuss Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber and G.H. Mead. And we will have brief discussions about Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer, because these are the people who are considered to be the very important people who contributed for the establishment of the discipline, who kind of played a very important role in the germination of the discipline, a kind of a transformation from social philosophy to sociology. But we will go much deeper into these four people who are considered to be the kind of a stalwarts, who are considered to be the pioneers, who laid the most rigorous theoretical foundation and methodological orientation for the discipline. So Karl Marx, Durkheim, Weber and Mead, these four philosophers, these four thinkers would be dealt with extensively in the coming classes, whereas the first four scholars we will not go that detail. And you would have identified that most of these people belong to France. Montesquieu, Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte and Spencer is from England, Marx German, Durkheim again French, Max Weber German and G.H. Mead he was from USA, United States of America. So mostly we have scholars from Western Europe who played a very vital role in the emergence of the discipline. So let us begin with Montesquieu, born in 1689 and passed away in 1755, and he was a French philosopher. So there is very raging debate, at least there used to be raging debate about the exact place of Montesquieu in the history of sociology. Can you call him as a sociologist or not? And this is a very difficult question, but almost every observers argue that Montesquieu played a very vital role in laying the foundations for the emergence of sociology, because sociology as a distinct discipline did not exist during Montesquieu's time. So it would be very difficult to label him as a sociologist the way we are able to label later scholars, but he was a very important person, a very important, extremely influential thinker who laid foundation for the theoretical arguments about the society. So, one of his most important books, in the spirit of the laws, he says that society must be considered as a thing. As a thing, its properties could be discovered by observation and analysis. Thus, for Montesquieu, morals, manners and customs as well as social structure are amenable to investigation in the same way as they are things or phenomena in physics and chemistry. This paragraph is something very important, because here comes a philosopher who argues that society must be considered as a thing, and we will come back to this word thing later when we discuss Emile Durkheim, because his definition of social fact, he argues that a social fact is a thing. It has an objective reality out there. It has its own existence. It is sui generic. This goes Emile Durkheim's arguments, and Durkheim was heavily influenced by thinkers like Montesquieu and Auguste Comte who preceded him. So here Montesquieu argues that the society must be seen as a separate entity, and then, so that is one part of the story. The other argument that this thing must be, this thing has its own properties and it could be discovered by observation and analysis. And here you are bringing in the argument of scientific methodology. Okay. Thus, for Montesquieu, morals, manners and customs as well as social structures are amenable to investigation the same way they are with physics and chemistry. So, this is a very powerful argument where he points out that the scientific methods that are in practice to understand the disciplines like physics and chemistry, or to understand the physical and chemical world, must be used or can be used to understand the nature of society. For example, about morals, about manners and customs and social structures, etc., can be studied the same way you study physical or chemical world. And this is a very, very important argument. And this was a major departure from the traditional conventional ways in which theological explanations were given as the most convincing explanation to understand the society, or more obscure kind of philosophical or metaphysical arguments were given. So here Montesquieu argues that Montesquieu kind of Montesquieu criticizes these arguments about theological or metaphysical explanation about social reality, and then argues that instead of using these arguments, you can use the path of science, you can use the methodology of science. And he attempted to formulate human laws and social institutions, theorizations on government, conceptions of liberty, political power, religion, climate, geography and so on. So, you will see how extensive his research interests were, and he was quite interested to formulate human laws. And this term is something very important. You are talking about human laws, and this is an extremely important indication to say that these early scholars were very particular about formulating laws. And you will see the same argument in Saint-Simon. You will see the similar argument in Auguste Comte, who believed that just like the physical laws or laws in biology or laws in chemistry, you will be able to formulate laws about society. You will be able to formulate overarching laws about society which will be able to rule, or which will discover the ways in which human society function. An argument which none of the social scientists would agree today. But given the understanding that sociology emerged as a science, especially heavily influenced by natural science, this was a predictable turn. They wanted to formulate human laws, and Montesquieu, he had very extensive research interests spanning or spreading across different distinct areas, starting from notions of liberty and government to religion, climate and geography and so on. And one of his major contributions is his typology of different forms of governments, which he talked about republican governments, which can take either democratic or aristocratic forms, monarchies and despotism. And this was Montesquieu's, this contribution is widely considered to be a very, very important one. He talked about these three distinct forms of government systems or governing forms, and with a kind of a developmental sequence. He argued that mostly the societies move from a despotism to monarchy, from there to that of republican governments, which either forms the have the character of democracy or that of aristocracy. So he had this kind of an evolutionary understanding of governance, and it implies that it has a developmental sequence. And he also tried to put forward this typology on the basis of capturing this schema from the empirical world. So instead of merely proposing a normative structure, here you come across a philosopher who observed different kind of government systems across the world and then put forward the kind of typology. And another very important contribution which we consider even now as some of the foundational rules or foundational or cornerstones of modern democratic system is the separation of powers between executive, legislative and judiciary to prevent despotism. And this particular separation of powers, which are considered to be so sacrosanct, which are considered to be so important, is even now very, very, very relevant, because we know that the kind of a separation between executive, the body that executes the rules, and the legislative body, the body that formulate new rules, and the judiciary who works as an arbitrator, who works who tries to and the judiciary which provides or which certifies the legality of these new laws and new initiatives, they must be separated. They must be separated, and you cannot allow a power that has a power over all these three distinct forms. And that is how every efficient democracy functions. They work as counterbalances. They ensure that no one part, either executive or legislative or judiciary, gets excessive powers. And this discussion, as you all know, is extremely relevant even now. We talk about the necessity for the independence of judiciary, we talk about the distinction between executive and legislation, and we argue that for a healthy democracy to thrive, these three spheres must be separated, and you can't allow one powerful entity to have absolute control over everything, or you can't allow somebody to be the person who formulates his own rules and who executes it and who also presides over its legality. That leads to what he calls it as the despotism. And also his ideas about liberty. Liberty, he argued that liberty is not without restrictions, liberty is not without boundaries, liberty is not without any kind of he argued liberty has to be limited and it must recognize the rights of others. So he developed an argument that the idea of individual freedom, the idea of individual liberty must be exercised in consonance with the rights of the people who are around you. And a very important liberal principle which we even consider to be, we consider even today to be something very important. And liberty also requires that the laws concerns only threats to the public order and security, and in that sense laws should not concern offences against God. Here you come across very interesting argument of Montesquieu, who is very, very critical of God, or very critical of the idea and institution of God, because he argues that liberty also requires that the laws concerns only threat to public order and security. So anything that can adversely affect the public order or the safety and security of the people must be kept in mind when you formulate the rules and laws about liberty. So anything that does not adversely affect the public order and security must be allowed, because human beings do have the right to profess their liberty, and in that sense laws should not concern offences against God. This is a very important, very, very interesting argument, because an act which is supposedly offensive to God according to Montesquieu, has no problem, because this particular act will not will not affect public order, it will not work against security. So he understood, or he even argued, that a criticism against God is welcome and people must be allowed to do that, because by doing that you are not doing anything to offend the public order, you are not doing anything to disturb the public order. And just think about the development, or think about the arguments of this particular theme in different societies, where blasphemy laws are very, very powerful in a number of countries, because any references or any offensive references about God is seen as blasphemous. So the argument there is that you must not insult God, or you must not abuse God, or you must not say anything critical of God, because that is seen as blasphemy, not because it is injurious to the public order or it endangers the society, but it was seen as an offense against God itself, which is not allowed, or which is punishable in the societies which are governed by theocratic rules or religious rules. So he argues that Montesquieu considers religions in relation only to the good they produce in civil society, and not to their truth or falsity. So you see, it's a major departure from the early theological argument that the religion tells you the truth, religion offers you the explanation for everything. And here Montesquieu argues that, of course, religion is important, religion has been a universal institution, it plays important function, but I am not here to say whether a religious explanation is true or false. I am only concerned about what religion does in the public realm, and only to the good they produce in society, in the civil society, what kind of roles that religions do or perform in the civil society. So that is the only relevance that he attributed to religion, not as a divine system, not as the epitome of all the truth or all the divine revelations, nothing of that sort. So in a sense he kind of secularized, secularized the kind of argument, and by specifically saying that he is not interested to see whether the religion is true or false, rather he understands it as an important social institutions, and to the extent that it performs certain good things, certain services to the civil society, he understands and then appreciates that. Another very important French theorist, French philosopher is Saint-Simon, who was born in 1760 and passed away in 1825, who is again considered to be a very, very influential scholar. So he had a crucial role in the early 19th century developments of industrial socialism, positivism, sociology, political economics, and the philosophy of history. So again, a person, a philosopher who had varied interest, a philosopher whom we cannot label as a philosopher or a sociologist or a political theorist, a person who had a very extensive range of interests. And he was one of the first to grasp the revolutionary implications of industrialization. He was one of the first European thinkers who identified that the kind of changes that are happening as a result of rapid industrialization is leading to a novel phase, or it is leading to a kind of a comprehensive change in the social structure. So the whole argument about industrialization and industrial society, he argued that it represents a kind of a rupture from the traditional agrarian society, and he was rather kind of welcoming to these changes for a traditional institutions and morality, and to conceptualize industrial system as a distinctive type. So as a philosopher, he argued that these changes are not only having its implication in terms of economy or in terms of say science and technology, but rather they have tremendous implications in traditional institutions. We briefly discussed in the previous classes how it adversely affected the traditional joint family system, how it traditionally affected the hold of religion and morality, a whole set of conventional notions of morality. The Victorian morality in Europe was severely affected with this rise of industrial society and the rise of the individual as not somebody who is completely bounded by the rules of tradition. So Saint-Simon envisioned an industrialist state directed by modern science in which universal association should suppress war. He believed that the men who are successfully able to organize society for productive labor are entitled to govern it. So he was quite forthcoming in terms of welcoming this new order, and he believed that the people who are taking the lead in this industrial society, who invent new things, who invest new things, who create more wealth, they naturally have the right to govern it, because he was also really concerned with the kind of social conflict. He was also really concerned with the kind of after effects of French Revolution, the kind of bloodshed that followed. So all these scholars were really concerned about bringing in some kind of social order or some kind of social equilibrium, some kind of a social balance into the society. And Saint-Simon believed that in a industrial society, it is the industrial elites who will be able to they will be able to bring in a state directed by modern science, because modern science is supposed to give you the kind of objective reality, objective knowledge about the society, and that objective knowledge must be utilized to govern it efficiently, govern it more peacefully, and so it must be able to suppress the war. He believed that the men who are successfully able to organize society for productive labor are entitled to govern it. Another very important area of Saint-Simon's contribution is his initial arguments or as a provisional formulation of what is often called as the evolutionary organicist theory, whose influence is reflected in social evolutionary doctrines as diverse as those of Herbert Spencer and others. So we will come back to this term later in more detail when we discuss Herbert Spencer and even Emile Durkheim to a large extent, because this was a very important stream of thought that developed during Saint-Simon's time, which looked at the kind of biological characteristics of human society. This was the tendency to compare a human society with a living organism, try to understand the way in which a living organism and a human society have specific structures, and how each of these specific structures cater to specific functions, and also the whole argument about living species emerging through an evolutionary process. So a host of philosophers, including Saint-Simon, Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer more profoundly, argued that there are parallels between the evolution of organisms and evolutions of human society. So this particular argument that there is an evolutionary organicism, that human society can be studied because they share quite a lot of similarities with the animal society, both in terms of structure and function, and also through this process of evolution, was a very prominent strand of thought during that particular time. And Saint-Simon is one of the most important founding fathers of that strand of thought, which kind of evolved into a very important argument or very important theoretical foundation, which is known as the structural functionalism. We will talk about that theoretical orientations much later in this course, because structural functionalism is widely seen as one of the most important, one of the 3 or 4 prominent theoretical orientations of modern sociological theory, the connection between the structure and its function. And so you will see Saint-Simon as a scholar who laid foundation for this thinking. And through Durkheim, his organicist conception of social order carried over into the contemporary functionalism in anthropology and sociology. So this structural functionalism was a very powerful theoretical framework in anthropology as well. In anthropology, because early anthropologists, many of them or most of them subscribe to this structural functional school. And in a country like India, Indian sociology was heavily influenced by structural functionalism, because a host of scholars, the most importantly M.N. Srinivas, considered to be a doyen in the Indian sociological field, was trained in British anthropology under British anthropologists who were specialists in structural functional school. So we see that the initial influence of Saint-Simon in the emergence of this particular school of thought, which evolved much later. And he was also among the earliest to advocate a naturalistic science of society as a rational guide to social reconstruction. This is a point which is quite familiar because we already had quite a lot of discussion about that. The argument that the natural science provides a model for social science to emerge as a distinct discipline because it is based on observable facts, it is based on verifiability, it provides you uncontaminated truths. It's not influenced by theology, it's not influenced by metaphysical or philosophical argument. It is based on empirical data, it is more objective, it is more verifiable, it is more impartial, it is neutral. So this argument that social sciences can be modeled after natural sciences also got a major fillip from Saint-Simon. So to conclude, these scholars represent a phase where there is a kind of a transformation from social philosophers to sociologists take place, because these people are not strictly sociologists of our time. They are not the one who, but they represent the kind of some of the very fascinating scholarship of philosophers who straddled various fields, whose area of interest was quite extensive, starting from philosophy to geography to politics to society to economy to morals to ethics. So they were not really confined to a more narrower or specialized field called as sociology. And again, as I mentioned, they were heavily inspired by the idea to formulate general laws that govern human society. They wanted to decode these general laws which can be applied across the world, just like natural laws, just like the law of gravity can be applicable, or gravity is applicable across the world. And they were also critical of theological and metaphysical thinking and paving way for the later formulation of sociology. So these two people, Saint-Simon and Montesquieu, are widely considered to be some of the most influential thinkers who laid foundations, who paved the way for the emergence of sociology as a more codified and more structured discipline later. So we will conclude this session now and continue with Auguste Comte in the next class. Thank you.